First of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here every year, and especially since this is the way that families find out about treatment and hope for their brain-injured children. The unfortunate aspect of it is that the medical profession's kind of abandoned neurologically injured patients, and there are very few avenues to seek treatment. But as we go along, there are more and more that are coming up. And so what I wanted to talk about today is hope, but also I want to talk about something that is a major problem in the neurological community and help give a little guidance. People who are here are survivors, and so this is more for the people to come, and many of you are going to be emissaries. You're going to get phone calls because of your children and your experience asking for help and guidance, and I want this to be a resource for the information that you can disseminate. It's also going to be on the website where we're going to refer people because there's a habit that occurs with severe neurological injury that needs to end. And that's what I'm going to talk about here today. Okay. So I changed the title of this a little bit per Rhonda. But it's about my child just suffered a catastrophic brain injury, and it could be any type of brain injury, traumatic brain injury, drowning, suffocation, cardiac arrest, but a very severe brain injury. And what do you do now? What can you do as a parent when this happens? This is probably one of the most devastating stresses, events that occurs in any parent's life, especially if your child doesn't make it. And why this subject, and that's what I just mentioned, is that there's a very disturbing common experience of too many parents in the ICU. And I'm sure a lot of you are going to identify with this. This applies to any type of catastrophic injury, in particular one where a child ends up in an ICU on a ventilator. But I'm going to focus on drowning for a number of reasons here. One, I've got a big experience with it now, probably over 140 children that I've treated who have drowned. And number two, it's the most devastating of all of the injuries. So with cardiac arrest, total absence of blood flow to the brain, and it's just a very severe injury. So what do you do when this has occurred, when it happened? And I don't say this lightly, but that's the first thing. As it turns out, a substantial number of parents find eventual treatment for their children by praying. And the number of parents, I can't tell you, who have said they prayed, they had a vision, it led them to, a relative mentioned this out of the blue, a therapy, and they ended up, getting treatment. After that, you hope, and that's all we used to have was hope. And that's what's often taken away from you in the ICU. Again, it's what I want to talk about here. And then, of course, there's treatment, which there has been none until really the last 10 years. And as time goes on, we're going to have more treatment. And the last thing that you can do is get your child out of the hospital and home as soon as you can. And I don't say that lightly or superficially, but there is something about being home, familiar surroundings, and the comfort of family and so on that is missing from an ICU. And that also goes to what I'm going to tell you can do in the ICU. So if we look at drowning as kind of the example of this, and just some quick statistics. Turns out it's the leading cause of unintentional injury-related death for children 1 to 4 years of age. It's the second cause for kids up to 14 years of age. And it turns out that for every child who doesn't make it from a drowning episode, about 7 others end up in the emergency room. Turns out the total figures per year in the U.S., adults and children, about 4,000 a year, die. Now, it's a small number, but still it's a big deal. And that amounts to about 10 per day. And the thing about this, we're going to talk about a little more, this happens so quickly. And it's silent. Everybody thinks, thrashing in the water and, people, or a child or someone screaming for help. It doesn't happen like that. It is very silent. And in fact, we had an episode with one of my children that I'll describe a little bit. Here are just some statistics. About 1,000 children a year. And if you look at this, most of them are the very young. And then as we get older, less and less. But then there's this big bump from 15 to 19, which is, teenage risky behavior and alcohol and other things that happen that get into trouble in the water. It's more common in boys, 3 to 4 to 1 compared to girls. And this is misleading. There's no gene for drowning. Black children and Native Americans drowning more frequently or a higher incidence. This has more to do with culture and poverty and lack of swim lessons, unfamiliarity with water and so on. There's no race issue, but it always gets reported, as racial figures. It's crazy. If we look about where this happens, very commonly it's in bathtubs for the under 1 year of age. But most of them are in pools. And then as you get older, the teenagers end up in lakes and rivers and so on. My experience, it's everything. A child, we've had a couple of them drown in buckets in bathtubs, giving a bathtub or giving a bath, and parent walked away for a minute for another problem or emergency. But really any site is where it can occur. And whose presence does it happen in? Most of the time, parents, but it's really everyone. Grandparents, other family members, frequently, like an older child is asked to keep an eye real quickly, and mom or dad has to take care of something. The friends, parents, guardians, caretakers, even, public organized pools, supervision. It is very hard to keep track of everybody in a pool. But it does happen quickly. 77% of them out of sight for 5 minutes or less. Now you think about that as a parent. I've got 5 kids. How often do you lose track of them for 5 minutes? You can't be present. And so, even though you try to. And here's the figure. This one is 5, but it's closer to 7. For every child that does die, another 7 are seen in the emergency room. And this was very interesting here. I think this figure is much greater now. This is the latest I could find. It was like 2016, but 2.4% end up in rehab hospitals. I think it's a lot more now. It's a small number, which was surprising. And this is just making the point about supervision and having a fully enclosed pool versus one that the house, the kids can always find a way to get out the doggy door, manage the locks. They're smart and clever and aggressive and curious. So you have to do what you can. So how do you prevent it? Well, nonstop supervision, as I said, is easier said than done. And we all know how easy it is to just lose sight of kids in a short period of time. But it happens, unfortunately. And the last part about statistics are costs. And the costs are just, almost all of them, inestimable in terms of loss of life for survivors, quality of life, what they don't experience or are not able to experience, at least up till now, for the rest of their life. And then these medical costs, which is the last thing and the least of them, but these figures come from 2015 are fantastically low. If you think of 1,000 children per year that die and it costs $6.6 million, that's $6,600 per child? No. Going to the emergency room, that's a Band-Aid, an aspirin, and a tongue blade. It's very, very expensive, huge expense. And Here's just the emergency department visits. Again, let's say 8,000 children. That's $1,000 per ER visit? No. It's a very, very expensive thing. And this is the hospitalization. Most of the children are in the hospital for a month. And you know what hospital costs are these days. It's just fantastically expensive. All right, so enough of that. So what happens to a person when you suffocate or lose blood supply, have a cardiac arrest? The entire body is deprived of oxygen, blood flow, and nutrients. And there's a term in medicine, it's called global ischemia, meaning globally there's no blood flow. And it turns out it's the most severe of all types of injuries. You can have trauma, an electrical injury, low sugar level. There are all sorts of different types of injuries, and this is really the most severe. And the critical factor is right here. Time is tissue, like with a heart attack. So the quicker you can reestablish circulation, the more you can salvage. And the time is critical, but it's highly variable. It can be minutes, and you hear these stories. My child was only in the water for 3 minutes, and yet has a devastating injury, and another child that was in for 15 or 20. And then, like little Eden Carlson, 100 minutes of CPR. Or the case I'm going to tell you about, the little girl from California. 60 minutes of CPR, and finally they declared her gone. And all the doctors and medical staff walked out of the room. And they disconnected her and let the family, be with her. And the dad, he describes this publicly, was just screaming to God to please bring his daughter back. He'd do anything. Just bring my daughter back. 18 minutes later, the nurse walks back in the room to see if there's anything she can do for the family, brought in a chair for another one of the members, and the grandmother was holding this deceased little girl and noticed her take a breath and just stopped in shock and watched and pulled her watch out and timed it, and she had started breathing and screamed to the medical staff, "She's breathing," and they all raced back in, hooked her back up, and resuscitated her. And now you'll see her in the little movie here. Just a tremendous story. But I mean, you would have thought, what were the chances? In 18 minutes then, with no CPR, no nothing, and no electrical activity, and come back. I think the father's prayer did something. I really do. And then the other problem is that once you get return of spontaneous circulation, there's a secondary injury. And I don't know, it's a cruel body phenomenon, but once you reestablish oxygen, it's almost like pouring gasoline on the fire. There's an intense inflammatory reaction that's even worse than the lack of oxygen. And supposedly that's the body's way of trying to help the process. But it causes some problems. It turns out when we can deliver hyperbaric oxygen right then, that's what it treats as that reperfusion injury. And there's extensive literature on this. So just to go on, as we move on with the injury, some brain injury or tissue is injured reversibly, some is not. Some is irreversible and will die. But what happens is the injury process makes the blood vessels leaky, and the brain cells begin to swell. So fluid comes out of the blood vessels, brain cells swell, and what happens is inflammatory process takes over, and there's an increased swelling of the brain and pressure in the brain. Well, we're in a closed box here, and there's nowhere for the brain to go, and as the pressure goes up, blood flow then coming into the brain decreases, and so there's another injury on top of it, and it just continues to build upon itself. That whole process peaks at about 48 to 72 hours. And this is kind of key because this is also the time period where parents are pressed to discontinue life support, to donate organs, and so on. And you have nothing to lose by just delaying, gaining time. You don't have to make that decision immediately. And this is something, it's a curiosity, and it's going to be throughout. I'm going to come back to it. But this is a picture of the brain on MRI, and it's taking a slice straight down the middle between my ears, and we're looking face on at a person. And what I wanted to show you is the blood supply here. Most of the blood supply to the brain are these spaghetti-like arteries that are all over the surface. But the ones at the deep center, they're called candelabra arteries. They're straight up. And there's something about them and this tissue at the center of the brain. It is exquisitely sensitive to drops in blood pressure and or absence of blood flow and blood pressure, to where this area is preferentially injured almost first in all of these types of injuries. And what is here? If you look at this area right behind here, that's the deep motor area of the brain. And you're going to see this in a couple of the videos. It's responsible for the uncoordinated and irregular movements. The area is called the basal ganglia. But running down through it are these white matter tracts. All of this white tissue here are the connecting tracts in the brain. So if we look up here, do you see the gray matter? You've heard of gray matter and white matter, right? The gray matter are the brain cells. And each of the brain cells sends out one process where its electrical message goes. And it branches and touches up to, by the time we're adults, 1,000 or more other brain cells. All of those connecting tracts are in this white tissue. They go right down through the center of this area. And that's what's also injured. And that's what's responsible for the loss of motor activity, which is so common in this injury and many others. It's damage to this area. And that's the one thing that you have to do on a long-term basis is regrow these motor tracts. So right now, I'm moving my hand. Where does that come from? My consciousness, however that happens, my soul, directs my motor area up here, all of those cells to start firing. And the electricity gets generated. It goes down these pathways into the deep motor area here, and from there down to the spinal cord and out to our peripheral nerves, or out the cranial nerves. And so what's happening here when you lose this is like taking out the railroad track. Nothing can travel down there. And that's what has to regrow. And we'll talk about that some more. So just a little bit, because I want to focus on MRI here, because this is the center of a lot of these predictions that get made in the ICU. If we look at, this is a CT scan, and these slices are like the pancake slices, the stack that is done with the CT scanner. And this is a normal brain. And you know how the folds are all on the outer side, outer perimeter of the brain. There are spaces between it, and the black is the cerebral spinal fluid. So you can see the spaces. And on the inside of the brain, we have a liquid system as well. Well, once the brain swells, it has what's called this ground glass appearance. You can no longer see a difference in the folds, and there's the gray matter. This is the opposite color here on CT. The dark area is the white matter. And you can see what happens to the fluid system. The brain, as it swells, it compresses it, and all of the fluid gets pushed down into the spinal cord. And that's what has to be dealt with early on. So what happens in the ICU? Critical care. Critical care is just trying to maintain survival or achieve survival. It is not rehabilitation. It's trying to minimize that damage and the reperfusion injury, the swelling, and so on. And that involves ventilatory support, usually on the ventilator, breathing for you, circulatory support, blood pressure, blood flow, treating brain swelling, and then many times there's an injury to the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system you can think of is the automatic nervous system. It's what controls our blood pressure, our breathing, sweating, circulation, all of our digestive function, all of our internal organs, essentially everything that's going on when we're sleeping. Stuff you don't have to think about. But you know, as we're sitting here and standing here, everything's kind of automatic on the inside, right? That's the autonomic nervous system, but that's what's injured preferentially in many of the children that have this happen. And so we're doing all of these things, but you would think you'd supply oxygen to an oxygen-starved brain. We don't do that. What is done? We only supply oxygen to our blood to keep it oxygenated in those high 90%. So everybody, when your child was in the ICU, you saw it. You're looking at the percentage. What's the pulse oximetry? Oh, looks good. 98%, 95%. Oh, great. Well, that's good in the blood. What's happening in the brain? Oxygen is very, very low. That's the injury. And there are only a couple ways of getting it into the brain. One is hyperbaric oxygen. The other is by just pulsing oxygen. And we're going to talk about that. But this is the craziness of the approach in this type of injury. So what are your considerations? And I had to kind of mollify this a little bit, but the first thing you need to do, I put seriously question predictions. Actually, I had the word up there, ignore predictions. Because what ends up happening, and there's almost this perverse compulsion to break the bad news to parents and make the predictions about the worst possible outcomes. And I'm sure all of you have experienced this in an ICU. You're given what I call the list of never-evers. Your child will never wake up, recognize you, smile, talk, eat by mouth, walk, have any quality of life, and the list goes on and on. I mean, it's really cruel. You know there's been a big injury, and you can be told, yes, there's a big injury. And outcome, though, is not predictable with certainty. And that's what I wanted to focus on here. This used to be true to some extent, that the outcome was terrible for those who survived. But in fact, things have changed now, and we do have treatment. And the medical profession needs to catch up with that. The intention is often made to fully inform parents, give them the necessary facts, but it really goes beyond that because it takes hope away from everyone. The other problem is that these statements are often made in the setting of that 72-hour period where people are being pressed for organ donation to turn off the ventilator, withdraw support. And I don't know if you realize, but there is a lot of money in organ donation. Well, hospitals make a lot of money off of that. They sell organs to other hospitals and so on. And it's a very premature thing to do. You have to be very certain. And this gets into the whole issue of brain death. Every state has different laws about that. And when parents call you and ask you about this, you need to, this is part of what I do on the phone is talking to parents. You don't need to be compelled and coerced into turning off a ventilator and withdrawing care unless there's absolute certainty that there is no future. And of course, here's the problem. I haven't found a parent who can bring themselves to rush to withdraw care. I think it's part of what we are as humans and parents. It's just impossible to do that. You want to try to do everything. And of course, rushing to withdraw care, it's very final. I'll give you the other example here is a little boy up in Boston who got strangled accidentally or wedged between the bed and a wall and stopped breathing. And got taken to one of the finest hospitals in the United States, big reputation, famous in academic circles and so on. And they kept telling his mother, you need to turn off the ventilator and declare him dead, etc. And she kept refusing, and of course they were browbeating her. And finally she decided, my child's gonna die at home. And arranged with the hospital, they were gonna put the child in the ambulance. I've never heard of this. Take him home, and the paramedics were instructed to extubate him once they got to the house and let him go. And so they did, and they pulled the tube out, and he breathed. And he's alive, and he recovered to varying degree. So, you have to be very certain before you make this decision. And the other thing that happens is in trying to predict. Oh, yeah, thanks, Jewel. I forgot about that. The hospital told the mother not to feed him. so 7 days into it, I think, something like that. You know, when you get discharged from the hospital, those discharge instructions, they set you up with all the follow-up appointments. Well, one of them was the feeding nutrition team. And they just happened to call the house because they didn't know what had happened and checking on the child. And they found out, oh, the child was home. Oh, what are you feeding him? He hasn't had anything in 7 or 10 days. And, you know, now they started the feeding. Anyways, you have to be certain before you make that decision. The other thing that happens, though, is that if you prematurely declare death and give up, you're not a survivor. You have no possibility of ever benefiting from any therapy that does come about. So look what's happened in the last 10 years. There has been almost nothing to offer the children. And now we do have things, and we're getting outcomes. These children are achieving higher and higher levels of function. And who knows what the future is going to hold. We don't know. Again, you have to be very careful with this. And this is what I wanted to focus on here, is how these predictions get made. And the reason I wanted to talk about this and make this kind of a focus of this talk is that so many of the parents that I talk to, the MRI is looked at, and then the parents are told that there is no hope. And sometimes it's also done on the EEG as well. But the MRI-based predictions are assumed to be reliable. In fact, they are not. And I want to spend a minute on just what is an MRI. And I want to just read this to you here. A strong magnetic field created by the MRI scanner causes the atoms in your body to align in the same direction. Then radio waves are sent in, and they move those atoms out of their original position. As the radio waves are turned off, the atoms return to the original position and send back radio signals that are picked up by a computer and given an image. So here's the magnet. You lay in there, and then radio frequency is fed in there. And I'm going to show you how this works. Our body is 65% water. Water is 1 oxygen and 2 hydrogens. The hydrogen, the little blue things, they're all pointing in different directions because water is pointing in different directions in our body. But also all of our tissues have a very large amount of hydrogen in them. Well, each one of those little hydrogen atoms spins just like the Earth does. You know, so even at the finest microscopic level, the subatomic level, we've got rotation of, and yet, you know, I'm stable here. You don't know it, but the 10 to the however many 50 atoms in our body are all spinning. Well, when you have a little electric charge that's spinning, it creates a magnetic field. So now, as you lay in that magnet and they turn on the magnet, all hydrogen atoms in our body, the godzillions of them, suddenly flip to align with the magnet. Now, you don't feel that, but it is every tissue in your body suddenly orients in the direction of the magnet. And as long as the magnet's going, it's held there. Well, then what happens? What they do is they feed in a radio wave that's specific to that little rotation frequency and all. And what it does is flip the hydrogen in the opposite direction. So here it is, radio frequency goes in and it flips in the opposite direction now. And it'll stay that way as long as the radio wave's going. Now what happens? You remove the radio wave and it flips back and it gives off that radio wave. That radio wave gets picked up by the computer, and God only knows how Dr. Friston in England put this together to be able to get then a picture of your body is just mind-boggling. I think it's the 8th wonder of the world, really. So what is an MRI signal? It's a change in that remitted signal, and it depends on the number of hydrogen atoms, water, in there. It's a proton magnetic radio frequency emission that tells us, kind of in general, the water content of a tissue. It doesn't tell you anything about whether that tissue is alive or dead. It's a proton signal and image. And if you have acute brain injury, you get a reduction in blood flow, the oxygen swell, or the cells swell because of lack of oxygen. So you end up with more water in the cells. Water also leaks out of the blood vessels, so you end up with more water in the brain. So what happens is you get more of a signal. So here it is. And you'll maybe see on the MRI, they call it the DWI signal, diffusion weighted imaging. And this is what they're making these predictions off. You see all the white? Okay, well, the white, really bright white, that's a lot of water in that area. A lot of swollen cells. But you've got partial injury in these areas. And you can see it's highly variable. And what happens is they look at this DWI thing and they go on to say that all that tissue is going to die. Turns out it's about 75% accurate. But, let's say that real density there, okay, 75% of that will die. But how about this area there that's much less dense? Only part of it. So you can't really, when we look at this, it's not 100% predictive. And if we look at adult stroke studies and even with children, about a fifth of the time, in fact, that DWI is wrong. It doesn't predict cell death. So we've got uncertainty with that. Plus, we've got the density of this where it's not complete. These predictions are not accurate. So here is a brain scan, and you can see the white here at the center. This is after, it's normal anatomy. The anatomy hasn't been distorted yet, but you can see this white area. It's in that deep center. There's injury there. When you look, and that's on this other sequence called FLAIR. When you look at DWI, here is the picture. And you can see almost the whole brain is injured. But does that mean it's going to die? No, it doesn't. But unfortunately, what's done is these MRIs are looked at, and it doesn't tell you whether it's dead or alive. And it, unfortunately, is not predictive. But it doesn't tell you whether a child is going to wake up or recognize you or smile or any of these never-evers that are given to you. It's just inaccurate. And so using the strong word, you have to ignore these predictions. You just can't make a prediction with certainty. So what's the evidence for this? Well, here is a little study I wanted to show you. They took 77 children who had had an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. Now, only less than a fifth of them actually had been due to drowning. About 70% of the children were normal. The other 30% had had disabilities from neurological injury and, airway problems and so on. So these were cardiac arrests of a variety of problems or different causes. And they did an MRI of the brain within 14 days of admission. And then they looked at the DWI images and they looked at the outcome at hospital discharge. So when the children finally got discharged home. And finally, what they found was that the greater amount of DWI signal had a worse outcome. Okay, we know it's greater injury, going to be a worse outcome. But it turns out 36% of them had a good outcome. Now, good doesn't necessarily mean walking, talking, running, being normal again, but functional at a higher level. And of the 13 drowned children, 6 of them had a favorable outcome. And the pictures here are showing the percentages that had the favorable outcome. It's down here in that 20% range. It's probably a little greater given the variability of it. Again, the most injured area is right down here in that center part of the brain. Well, that was just the outcome at hospital discharge. It didn't tell us about long-term outcome. So now what happens when you add all of these therapies? You're going to get improvement. So again, this DWI is not a perfect predictor. And when families call you and ask you about what happened to your child and they're in the situation of this and this is what happens, people are getting connected from the ICU. Let them know. Come to the website and look at this because these predictions are not accurate. And you should not be forced to make decisions based on what an MRI looks like. Okay, well, how about what happens to the children who do have an unfavorable outcome, a very severe disability? What can we say about brain function in these children? And I'm going to go back to what a lot of parents will say in the ICU. Often what happens is, and I get a phone call, and the parents say, I know he's in there. And I said, well, and how do you know that? What are you doing? We walk into the room, and when he hears our voice, we see his pulse go up on the monitor. Or there's a stirring, or there's some activity, or when they touch him, it has a calming effect, and they can see an effect on the monitor with heart rate, or the ones who are breathing with breathing. And they can tell, even by touch and so on, that their child is sensing them and feeling them. Well, unfortunately, everybody's hurried in the medical profession, and you come in and the doctor does his evaluation and they try to stimulate and maybe check to see if there's a response to pain and push and do all of this stuff. And, what is most injured in here, as I showed you, are those white matter tracts, the connectivity. You don't have the motor ability to respond, and or it is significantly delayed. But if you don't see a response immediately, they're quick to say, oh, no response. And or what happens is, with the injury, the only thing that's working are the uninjured motor tracts. So if a child then tries to respond, how can they respond? Only with the motor tracts that work. And there are certain ones that are preferentially injured. So often extension is less injured. So what happens is they will give what looks like stereotypic reaction. And it's deemed reflex. Not always, not necessarily. And so what happens is, what they did was they looked at these children who had unfavorable outcomes. And this was from 2017, and it was published right out of next door here, San Antonio, University of Texas, San Antonio. And what it was 10 severely drowned children, 11 healthy, uninjured children, so they had a control group. And what they did was a special type of MRI. So these MRIs usually are just for anatomy. You're looking to see what's there, is there swelling, the type of tissue, water versus brain tissue. But there's also a type of MRI you can do which is live and continuous. You lay in the magnet, and what it does, you image blood flow. And in particular, the iron in our hemoglobin is a ferromagnetic atom. So it shows up on MRI. And what they do is they can track blood flow. And of course, the way the brain works is I'm right now thinking and talking, which means that my speech areas suddenly get ramped up. It's like turning up the RPMs on an engine. Metabolism turns up, electrical impulses start going, and eventually electricity comes out down the nerves to make me talk and all. And so what is happening is, as the cells metabolize, they demand more blood flow. So what the MRI does, it tracks blood flow. And you can see the areas of the brain that work. So what they did was a whole battery of functional questionnaires in addition to the parents and what they could do in examining the children. And they looked at all these different categories: motor, eating, drinking, tactile perception, visual motor, auditory, receptive language, expressive language, all the different areas of our brain. And they were able to do a measurement of expressions of pleasure, displeasure, application of the future. And if we look at the children, I'll show you a little table here. They had all had their drowning incident, in the average 2 to 2.5 years of age. And they were now almost 5 years after the incident. Every one of them had had CPR and had to have their heart shocked. So this was cardiac arrest. This is severe injury. All of the stuff I'm showing you some before. All of them were comatose in the hospital on a ventilator. All of them had brain swelling that had to be treated. So these are the most severely injured children. All of them with prolonged hospital stays. And most of them, I'll show you this in this table, were advised the parents to withdraw care. All of them now were severely disabled, locked in, which is motor, no activity, eyes open, or minimally conscious. They, are awake and have, some motor activity. But all of the caregivers and parents believed that these children were conscious and aware of themselves and their environment. So, if we looked at the children alert, awake, attentive to the environment, 3 had just a little bit of speech, 7 had no intelligible speech, 2 were in this locked in, 5 incomplete locked in, 3 between locked in and the minimally conscious, 4 communicated by eye gaze, Non-speech sounds, one of them. Eye gaze, computers, 2. And 3 had no ability to communicate. All lived at home with parents, none of them on ventilators. They all had normal sleep-wake cycles. 9 of the 10 still had G-tubes, and most had difficulty swallowing saliva and required periodic suctioning. So again, they were severely injured. And here they all are, up to 12 years old now, 5 to 12. And if we look at the acute MRI, some of them were normal, a few of them. But even with a normal MRI, this one here, the family was told to withdraw care. The rest of them, though, had abnormal MRIs, global injury, diffuse swelling of the brain. And look at this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 were told to withdraw care. 1, they were recommended to just put the child in an institution. And here was their category. So they were all severely injured at this point. All right, well, here are the MRIs. On the top row of these are the 11 critical networks in the brain that supply all different brain functions that I listed in those tests that they did. And the white and brown is the areas that were tested for each of these functions. They all have a name. The green is the area that is most severely injured. And in children who have had a drowning episode, it's the cerebellum, which controls coordination, and it's that deep gray center of the brain that I showed you on the first picture. The blue are the normal children, the control group. And these are the areas that they looked at for all of these brain functions. The pink is the overlap with the children who had severe injuries. So if you look at this, these children had substantial activity working in all of these critical brain areas and overlap with the normal children, which meant that they were in there and they could process and they could feel and they had consciousness. And this was their function. This is more normal function. All of these lowered areas were those motor areas. But what they did have was all of this: receptive language, communication, social, emotional, expression of pleasure, displeasure, anticipation of the future even, sensory perception, and all the different functions. It was motor that was lacking. This just showed the degree of it. The most severe, less, and the ones with the least. So blue is where they have the most injury, or little overlap with normal. What they found, though, was this default mode network, one of those networks, which is the area that's responsible for intrinsic connectivity. It's the brain's default network. So if I just stop talking and I'm just being right now, it's what of my brain that's active. It's our awakeness, awareness, and so on, and responsible for all of our higher mental functions, including introspection, social cognition, motivation, but all of these things. And what happened was this corresponded to what the caregivers were saying, that the children were in there and they seemed to understand them. The other key finding is that when they looked at this and told the parents the results of this, it had an impact on what the families started to do with these children, meaning they could understand them, and it changed the way that they interacted with them and what they started to do in terms of therapies and so on. But here was the key: the acute imaging findings. In other words, that MRI in the ICU failed to reliably predict outcomes. So the message here that you can pass on is that you don't make decisions in the ICU about turning off care and predictions of the future based on an MRI. The other finding is what I have found for the last 37 years. It's these white matter tracts that are the most injured, the long white matter tracts in particular that control motor function. And that's what we're trying to focus on the most. So hyperbaric oxygen, which is what I do, stimulates growth of white matter. But even the long white matter tracts, it's a long-term process to try to do this. And there are going to be other ways to stimulate this that come along. So what does all of this mean? Despite the severe injury, despite recommendations to withdraw care, you can't make these predictions. As I said, they're inaccurate, to say the least. And children can survive with preservation of many of their human functions, it doesn't deny that they still have a severe injury and their quality of life is affected. But in addition, there are newer therapies coming around all the time. If you look at when this study was done, they submitted it for publication in 2016, 4 months after the little Eden Carlson episode or case and her treatment. And if we look, that it takes about 2 years to kind of solicit children to be in a study and then fly all of them to San Antonio to image them, perform the study, write the paper. And they were 2 to 10.5 years after drowning, which means this happened between 2003 and 2012 when the children had their accident. Or I should say when they entered into the study and they were a few years out already. What kind of therapies were present at that time? Very, very little. In fact, nothing in the standard medical community except OT, PT, and speech therapy. Well, what would all these children be like now with all of these therapies? We don't know, but I'll tell you they're going to be better. Because all of these things you've seen yesterday and hyperbaric oxygen and other things, all of the therapies that we talked about are stimulative and they're all stimulating recovery. And of course, every year we find out new things that can be used. Okay, so the last part of this, you get to the ICU, you're now in the ICU, what can you do? Your child's brain needs oxygen, and hyperbaric oxygen is the ideal way to deliver that because that extra oxygen gets dissolved in the liquid portion of the blood. It's not in the hemoglobin. So right now, we're all 98 to 100%, our hemoglobin saturated. Just a little whiff of oxygen, we're 100% saturated. The more oxygen you give, the more goes in the liquid, and now when you increase the pressure above our atmospheric pressure, you pour even more into the liquid. And what happens is you're able to reach the areas of brain where that swelling is, and there can be just plasma flow. The red blood cells aren't in there, but just the liquids flowing through. And that's part of how this works. But the problem is, despite hyperbaric centers in 1,500 hospitals in the country, we can't get any hospital to do this. Part of it's dependent on the training of the hyperbaric doctors. Part of it's dependent on the equipment. You have to have a high-speed ventilator or go in with the child and bag. And in 37 years, I've only been able to do this 3 times. 2 of them are in the last 6 months, and that's the good news. And there's better news coming. One of them was July 4th of 1997, and a little 11-year-old boy in New Orleans had drowned. Heat wave in the country, and there was a pool with a non-functioning pump, green water, and these kids all jumped the fence, went swimming, didn't know how to swim, and he was underwater for, they estimated, about 15 minutes. They got him to the emergency room, and the doctor in the emergency room is a colleague of ours who a few years earlier, a couple merchant seamen had jumped into the hold of a cargo ship on the New Orleans docks and ended up with dead air, contaminated air, no oxygen, immediate cardiac arrest or respiratory arrest. And they brought him to the emergency room and thought they'd been poisoned with carbon monoxide. Well, carbon monoxide poisoning is one of the uses of hyperbaric oxygen emergently in the hospital. They called us up and brought him over, and the carbon monoxide levels were low, and we thought, this is odd. It was a anoxic brain injury. This was like drowning. We put him in the chamber. We had him in within hours, and these guys woke up, 2 of them, and eventually we treated them on a longer-term basis, and they had a very good outcome. And here's this doctor, he said, wait a minute, these merchant seamen, drowned child, what's the difference? Called me up. They had a hyperbaric unit there. It was run by my technician. And within 90 minutes, we had this little 11-year-old boy, Chris Dixon. It was a published thing, so I'm not sharing private information. In the chamber, 1 treatment. The next day, they removed the sedatives, the paralytics, eyes open, breathing tube came out, home 3 days later, July 8th, 97. School opened in August 15th, went back to school. In March, he was featured in Methodist Hospital's national magazine. It's 1997. We haven't been able to do that again until 2 months ago. And 2 months ago, the children who come to New Orleans to get hyperbaric treatment with me, many of them stay at Ronald McDonald House. Ronald McDonald House, they just opened a brand new 22-bed Ronald McDonald House on the Children's Hospital campus. It's 100 yards from the ER. And these children are fragile, and the average child, frequently ends up in the emergency room from simple colds and so on. And the ER staff there have seen many of the children that I have treated. And this little drowned girl got flown in from Mississippi. And the ER doctor said, needs hyperbaric oxygen. Called up our group, and my senior partner went in the chamber with her at the hospital, above the hospital objections. We're not supposed to treat any children. And this little girl got revived. They treated her, I think, 4 times in the hospital, and she got discharged home. Now, she's not completely normal. She still has some neurological injury, and we're trying to get her back to do follow-up and, see how things are going. But that is the second time in all these years. And the third one just happened at a hospital in California about 4 months ago. And the doctors decided to do it because the parents found out about this online and pressured the ICU doctors. Well, I had interfaced with that group of ICU doctors 2 years before with another child. And they didn't do it at that time. But what subsequently happened now with this mother, and now with all of the videos out and the other information, they called up and they decided to do it. And they treated this child, and they had some improvement. And things needed to be done a little bit more and a little differently and so on. But the good part was they were willing to do it, and they were so impressed that they've now called up. And just last week, I was out there meeting with them. We're going to try to set up a program where we can get acutely drowned children and other severe injuries treated in the hospital. It's a foot in the door, and it's the first step, but progress, and that's what I wanted to convey. So the only other choice, what else can you do in the ICU in the absence of being able to get this done? You can do normal baric oxygen. What's normal baric oxygen? So right now, we're all breathing 21% oxygen. We're at 1 atmosphere of pressure, sea level. We're a little bit above here, but 1 atmosphere absolute is sea level pressure. That's the weight of all of the air from here up about 100,000 feet, okay? The weight of that air is 14.7 pounds per every square inch on our body all over. Okay, well, 21% of that is oxygen. And that gives us enough we need to live. But you can give more. And that oxygen, all that's doing is running all of our functions. But oxygen is very curious. If you elevate the amount, give yourself some amount, and then take it away, the oxygen no longer is just for metabolic stimulation. It acts like a drug. And it signals many genes in our chromosomes to express themselves. And this has not been appreciated for hundreds and hundreds of years now. Until the last, let's say, 15 years. There are now published episodes of using this for stroke, acute traumatic brain injury, and in some other episodes. We started using it for our patients in the hospital who were getting hyperbaric oxygen for wounds. And they ran out of reimbursement and couldn't do any more hyperbarics in the hospital, so we transitioned to home, and we'd send them home on an oxygen concentrator. But you wouldn't sit on the oxygen. When you do that, the body acquires very rapidly an adaptation to it, and it no longer has any signaling capability. In fact, the longer you're on it, you can get toxic from it. But when you give it and take it away, there's the signal. So we'd have the patients go home, and they'd breathe it an hour a day from the oxygen concentrator, sitting there watching TV, doing whatever, passive. But it stimulates, and it would help heal these wounds. It was slower, but it helped. And so what happened is I started doing this. The little Eden Carlson story, I don't know how many of you know it, but 8 weeks, been discharged home from the hospital after the drowning episode at 4.5 weeks. She'd been home 3 to 4 weeks, and she was sent home on what was called rescue oxygen. When she would fall asleep, take a nap, she would stop breathing sometimes. And the parents were told, okay, here's the oxygen concentrator, give her oxygen. And if she turns blue and you stimulate her, do whatever you can to get her to breathe. So parents called up, they're in Fayetteville. From Fayetteville to New Orleans, it's about 8.5 hours of nothing. I mean, farmland, woods, no big population centers. And you get in a car and a child stops breathing and you're out in the middle of nowhere. What do you have? You have a calamity. And we couldn't have that. So I said, look, let's try what's been done before. I want you to take that oxygen concentrator and give the oxygen intermittently. And I'm going to show you the video because I told her, please video her before and video her after. You have to capture this because we want to be able to demonstrate this as it's worked for others. And I'm going to show you that video. But now I've done this with 100 or more children in ICUs all over the US and the United States and internationally. And what I want to show you here is that about 80 to 90% of the time we'll see the children respond in the first 48 hours. And where you see this first is in their eyes and face. Eye opening, fixation, tracking, gaze, and facial expression, starting to move their face and respond. You can also see movement and stirring and so on. But you see it first here. And it usually occurs in delayed fashion. It's not while you're on the oxygen. It's usually hours later. And the reason is that whole gene expression thing I talked about, where oxygen and hyperbaric oxygen. What's been shown is we are stimulating over 40% of all the genes in our chromosomes. That's 8,101 of our 19,000 genes. And the largest groups that get turned on are the growth and repair hormones and the anti-inflammatory genes. And the largest clusters suppressed are the ones that cause inflammation or associated with it, and the ones that are associated with cell death. So every time you go in a chamber, we're stimulating tissue growth, inhibiting inflammation, and turning off cell death. And when they looked at that gene expression, the majority of those 8,101 genes were turned on 12 to 24 hours after the hyperbaric treatment. It's the same with the normal baric oxygen. So you look for it in delayed fashion. A few hours later is when it starts. And some of these responses have been pretty dramatic. So what I want to show you, David, go ahead and either one of the top two videos. This is Eden now at home, and it's before her first normal baric oxygen treatment. And I want you to watch the motor activity with her, uncoordinated, and that's that deep gray matter in the brain, the basal ganglia.
Where's Daddy?
And look at her eyes and her face.
Where's Mommy?
When you can see her eyes. They're dull, they don't focus, but the movements are kind of jerky and not coordinated. And she's miserable.
Say hi. Oh, there you are.
Okay, she finally, there's a little gaze fixation there, but you look at her eyes, they're just dull.
Fussing, huh? Or are you going to show us some fussing? Yeah. Calm down.
Yeah, she's miserable.
Calm down.
Girl. Hey.
And now you're going to see her after
What you doing?
2 of these administrations.
You watching TV?
Oh, not yet. I'm sorry.
More of it. You watching TV? Watching the piggies?
Okay, go, David, to 8:56 or 8:39. So this now is after 2 of these. This is an 11-minute video on YouTube that the family posted. Again, this is right before. I'm sorry, that's not. This is, I think, after the first one. So the muscle movements have calmed down and keep going. This a little. I'm sorry, we didn't get this timed exactly right. Play it a little farther, David. You're going to see her watching a movie on a tablet. There it is. There it is. Okay, that's after 2 oxygen treatments. Look at her eyes. Do you see the sparkle in them? There's something, you've heard the eyes are the window to the soul. And that there is something about the reflectance of our eyes, and after brain injury, they're dull. I don't know whether it's an electrical effect, what it is, something with oxygen, but you can see it in their eyes, the change. But look at facial expression. Where is all the motor movement? This was 2 45-minute treatments of 2 liters of oxygen per minute. Now, she'd been that way for 8 weeks. So we did this for 3 weeks, and by 3 weeks, she was no longer having these fall asleep, stop breathing episodes. She had had some neurological repair and was safe enough to put in a car and drive, 8, 9 hours safely. And come to New Orleans. And there's another video then showing what happened with the hyperbaric treatment when we added pressure. And I'm going to spend just a second on that. Hold on 1 second, David. Okay, the other one I'm going to show you here. And I got to explain the case before we start it. But anyways, we were able to pressure. We don't think of pressure because we don't feel it. But barometric pressure, we are under pressure right now, atmospheric pressure. In fact, our body is full of pressure sensors. And all you've got to do is ask any arthritis patient, what happens when a low pressure front rolls through? They feel it in, oh, we got some, We're in church, yes, I hear it, yeah. You feel it in your joints, but we are very pressure sensitive. All cells in our body, all living organisms. And pressure is like temperature. It is in fact a thing, but we've never thought of it that way. And in the field of hyperbaric medicine, no one has appreciated this for the 362 years of its existence. It turns out that barometric pressure, just pressure purely by itself, is more bioactive on our genes than the oxygen, and is probably the main thing responsible for all that gene expression, if you believe the animal experiments that show this. So the pressure is the added component that we do when you finally are able to get into a chamber. Okay, so this next one is going to be a mom, Shaima Baru, in Morocco, whose little boy, Aiden El Jariri, drowned. And they're in the ICU, and she's, of course, online, and she finds the story of Eden Carlson, and she finds out about other children, and she calls up. And I told her, look, the one thing you can do, just get him started on the normal baric oxygen, and please video him before and afterwards. So what you're going to see is the before and after. One treatment, and this was immediately before and then just right after, shortly after, had a very quick response. And I want you to focus on his motor activity because, again, it's that deep gray matter area of the brain, the basal ganglia, that is primarily injured, and you're going to see that. And then you'll see him further as he got it. The rest of the time in the hospital, the doctors were very open-minded, and then we treated him here in New Orleans. And while they were here, the news had reached out, and both he and I think little Sophia are in here also. So go ahead, David. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to segment this out. It's a full 3.5 minutes of the news. It's not supposed to be a silent.
Family has come nearly 5,000 miles.
They came 5,000 miles.
Last August, a parent's worst nightmare, a little boy learning to crawl slipped out of his parents' view and into the pool. Shaima remembers her husband's devastating words.
I just remember him bringing him out of the pool and be like, that's it, it's done. Your brain just doesn't accept it. Like, there's nothing in life that prepares you for that moment.
There was CPR. Aiden's heart stopped and started. He was on a ventilator. Doctors at the hospital in their home, all the way in Casablanca, Morocco, gave him a 5% chance of living, but in a severely debilitated state.
5% chance of living.
Just pushed him to a vegetative state where he was tube-fed for like a week. He had horrible spasticity, dystonic movements, not sleeping through the nights, not following with his eyes.
2 months later on the web, Shaima found our story on another toddler who nearly drowned and was treated with hyperbaric or
That's Eden.
pressurized oxygen. She called Dr. Paul Harch. He recommended to Aiden's doctors to give him special doses of bursts of nasal oxygen.
I've got 10 published studies on use of just intermittent supplemental oxygen in various other types of traumatic brain injury, for instance, stroke.
Still, the Moroccan
Okay, there he is
doctors were
before,
skeptical.
and that is after
After
one
the first
administration.
session,
Look at the
and I'm
motor
not
movement.
kidding,
He's
he
calm.
was a completely different
Smiling.
child. The spasticity completely disappeared. And after the second session, he was tracking with his eyes. Third one, smiling. Fourth one, laughing. And then he started interacting with us.
Now they've traveled more than 4,000 miles to get several weeks of pressurized oxygen treatments in Dr. Harch's tanks in Marrero.
That was the first time he sat up.
information is there that hyperbaric oxygen has beneficial effects on injured tissue. The American Heart Association came out and endorsed hyperbaric oxygen for acute heart attacks.
Her doctors told her oxygen treatments would not work. There are doctors in the U.S. who are skeptical as well. But she remembers well one doctor visit back home.
His neurologist literally called all the people working in his office to come check him out. They could not believe their eyes. And the physical therapist was like, I've never witnessed such a miracle in such short time.
Now the toddler, who was in a vegetative state from September to October, is already talking, playing with blocks, putting things in a cup, and handling his bottle on his own. Meg Farris, Eyewitness News, Medical Watch.
The treatment center is in Marrero, but will be moving to Metairie in the coming weeks. Insurance usually does not pay for brain treatments. The child is getting weeks of daily treatments.
You know, the nice thing about that is they usually go and find an anonymous neurologist to dispute it. They couldn't find one. All right, thanks, David. All right, so what else can you do in the ICU? We're almost done here. Actually, there's very little medically. Anything that you try to do that's not traditional often is a fight. But, you know, more and more, the ICUs are accommodating it. And interestingly, we're getting less of the ICUs resisting normal baric oxygen. In fact, there are now so many of these ICUs I've interfaced with, and I offer to talk to the doctors, tell the family, get them on the phone. And I send them a list of 10 references on this. So they can't claim that it's non-science and voodoo or anything else. And what's happening is the minds are opening up. But what else can you do? Your child is in there. Now, yes, there are some where the swelling is so severe and they are not going to make it. But you can't tell that with certainty. So you stimulate them as much as you can in terms of, you know, talking to them, singing to them, being near them, touching them, doing everything you can. Talk to them, recite stories, their pets, their brothers and sisters, etc. Tell them how much you love them. And then get them home as soon as you can. What you can do at home is usually the rehab hospitals have, you know, the triumvirate, OT, PT, and speech therapy. To do those therapies, you generally need participation. With severe injury, a child can't participate, so you can do a lot of those things yourself at home, and the boost that you'll get from them bringing them home is significant. But you can do passive range of motion, and you can do stimulation for swallowing and other things. So try to get them home as soon as you can. Try to get them normal baric oxygen. And like I said, I will talk to any doctor, any of your doctors about this. And it's a rare one who they're pretty surprised when they finally get on the phone, because I send them this list of references and all. and they're willing to look at it, the vast majority of, and there's no toxicity to it. There is no toxicity. Nobody has ever been able to show a negative effect from this amount, little amount of additional oxygen. And then as soon as you can, add the last component, which is pressure, which is, a hyperbaric treatment. And what that does is stop the injury process and start stimulating recovery. The other things you can do, try to wean medications as soon as possible. Now you got to be careful with these because the longer you're on them, some of them there's a dependence, and especially the benzodiazepine family, which is Valium, Xanax, Klonopin. It's Klonopin and Klonopin, somewhat Valium, that they're placed on frequently, and Ativan. So if they've been on it for months, you cannot quickly withdraw those. My emergency medicine group used to have the contract at Orleans Parish Prison for a period of time for emergency medical care, and I worked there for 5 years or so. We saw all of the new intake, did all the new intakes on all the new inmates who had medical problems. And heroin, crack, meth, it didn't matter what drug you were on, cold turkey, Pepto-Bismol, Advil, and an antispasmodic, except for the Valium family drugs. You didn't take anybody off those because they'd have seizures if you abruptly, stopped them. So you have to be careful with those. But you want to try to get them off the medication because those are usually given for all of the acute problems in the ICU. The storming, the blood pressure problems, the heart rate problems, spasticity, all of that. But they're all psychoactive medications. They're all designed to work up here. And they have sedative effects and slow down effects. All the anticonvulsants are slowing down electrical activity in general. And so the sooner you can get them off of that, that will also help waking up your child and allowing recovery to occur. And of course, add additional therapies. Hyperbaric oxygen is not the be-all, the end-all, and the only. It's what we found is I call it a foundational biological therapy because of what it does in so many ways and its gene expression. However, neurorehab is a combination of everything. This does it biologically, and other therapies also have, biological activity, but you eventually add these things, put them together, and you want to stimulate brain tissue growth, and that's what we're after. White matter, new connecting tracks, making new connections. This conference. So, if I could sum all of this up, and I tried to put this real nice words because it's going to be, on the internet. Yeah, be extremely cautious of predictions made in the ICU based on MRI findings and the time of return of circulation. I would tell you to ignore them. Let the child get to a point where you're past this very acute period. There is no rush to try to turn off a ventilator. There's no argument that can be made for that, except a financial one or an organ donation one. Long-term outcomes of even the most severely disabled show preservation of most of our human functions, except the motor function. That's the other key point. The third is that you can get normal baric oxygen for every single child in the ICU. Drowning, it doesn't matter. Whatever, any acute brain injury. It works the same way. Get your child home as soon as possible. Get hyperbarics as soon as possible. Get additional therapies as soon as possible. And like I said, and I want to make this very clear, I will talk with any ICU doctor or any doctor to give them this information so that this can be done. And you can do it at home. Thank you.